Okay, I think we'll make a start. So good evening, everyone. My name is James Adler. I'm the Chief Executive of Ashdown Forest. Welcome to one of the harder ways to give a presentation. It's always harder without being able to see your faces and to see your reactions to the presentation. But I will nonetheless talk you through something we've done, I think now 6 times out in the local village halls around Ashdown. And thank you for joining us on what is a pretty cold evening outside, and the forest does not look like this opening picture at the moment in time. It is covered in 6 inches of snow and it's incredibly cold. But nonetheless, we are going to talk this evening about Ashdown in a warming world. And it is, at times, this presentation is not an easy one. The world is not in a great state. We are not treating it well. So there will be some information in here which can be hard to hear and challenging as well. But nonetheless, if you stick with me and stick with the talk, there are some messages of hope as we move through the presentation and some action that we can take. And that's where I really want to leave you at the end of this evening with some real message of what you can go away and do, both for yourself, locally, and indeed internationally as well. There are some options that you can do to really make a difference. I'll just repeat once more, we are recording the session. It will be available after this as well. So we'll think about how we're going to distribute that. If you want to put a message in the chat, you're very welcome to. You can either do that direct to me, but what we'll do is we'll answer questions at the end. So having said all of that, we will make a start. So what am I going to talk about tonight? I am going to talk about what climate change is. I'm going to describe that and try and get across in a very simple way what climate change is. I'm going to talk about, is it real? Because there are certainly still some people out there who don't feel it's real. Why it matters, both for us, but also for the other species that we share this planet with. What we can do on Ashdown, and indeed what we are already doing. What you can do to help. That's a key part that we'll focus on. And I'm going to hopefully, as I said, leave you with that message that not all is lost. We can very much make a difference to this crisis. I'm going to talk very briefly about an attack on nature, because this is still affecting the forest. We still have great concerns. I'll talk a little bit about funding of the forest as well, and then I'll happily take some questions at the end. So I'm aiming to speak for about 55 minutes, and then answer some questions thereafter. So what is the greenhouse effect? And this animation will take us through it. I'm sure many of you were taught it at school or have heard about it. What I hope is that you realise is the greenhouse effect is absolutely critical to our survival on this planet. It is the reason that life exists. So sun comes in and it reaches the earth. Some of it's reflected back into space, but some of it is absorbed by the land and by the oceans, and then it's held within by a blanket of gases that exists around the world. And it's as simple as that. Without the greenhouse effect, without this blanket of gases around the world, we would very simply be lifeless. We would be like the moon, we would be like Mars, we'd be like the other planets, where the conditions for life would not exist. So in its most simple way, the greenhouse effect is a blanket of gases around the world that keep us warm. If I can just encourage anyone who's not on mute to go on mute. Let me just see if I can see anyone who's not on mute. Okay, that's done. Great. So that's what the greenhouse effect is. It's not a bad thing. It's absolutely vital. So what is climate change? Because they're not the same thing. Climate change is basically what the human race has been doing, which is changing that blanket of gases. We've been adding to it by burning fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. And we've been simply putting that into the atmosphere to increase the ability of that blanket to hold in heat. So on the left-hand side of this slide, you've got the standard greenhouse effect that we've already spoken about, with heat being radiated back out of the Earth's atmosphere. And on the right-hand side, you've got the enhanced greenhouse effect, or climate change, where more heat is held within the blanket. And it is simple as that. That is what we're talking about. Humans are adding to that blanket of gases. It's holding more heat in. Hence, it's leading to climate change. That is at its absolute most simple. So here's the big question. Is it real? So some people don't doubt that the blanket is getting thicker, but they doubt whether it is actually having an effect. Other people don't even accept that the amount of emissions that we're producing are adding to the blanket. And on this slide, you have perhaps 2 ends of the spectrum. On the left-hand side, you have Greta Thunberg, a fairly famous international climate activist who has very deep concerns about society's ability to survive. and certainly she believes that society needs to change quite radically. And on the right-hand side, you have an ex-US president who has spoken before of his skepticism around climate change. The ex-president will indeed make his appearance later on in this slideshow as well. Just so that this brings it a little bit closer to home, we received this tweet after doing a fundraiser on the forest a few weeks ago, which came as a surprise. We were talking simply about photography that was happening on the forest, and we then got into discussing a little bit about climate change and biodiversity loss. And we got this tweet into the Ashdown Forest account. So pushing climate lies, such as need to reduce CO2. We need more of it to help plants and trees which produce oxygen. A quite remarkable statement and a bit of a surprise. And it shows that we've still got work to do even here on our doorstep of helping people understand the need to mitigate and protect the world against climate change. So what follows are a series of slides interspersed with photos to really try and drum it home for why the world is changing and how it's changing, how we know it is changing. So this is a BBC slide, which shows the top 10 hottest UK days on record. I hope you can see in about 1910, you've got 36.7 degrees centigrade. All of the others, all the other 9, are after 1990. And you can see up the top right-hand corner, you've got the 19th of July this year at over 40 degrees, which is the hottest year on record. So that's the information that we have. The top 9 hottest days are over there on the right-hand side of the slide. We know that greenhouse gas concentrations are at their highest level in 2 million years. We know that because of that, the Earth is 1.1 degrees warmer than it was in the late 1800s. And we know that the last decade is the warmest on record. All of those things are a statement of fact. We also know that temperature rise is 10 times faster than the last mass extinction. And in that last mass extinction, we know that 95% of marine and 70% of land species were wiped out. So we know that it is happening, and it's happening quicker than the last mass extinction. And you look at those species loss, which is simply terrifying. And this quote is from the International Panel on Climate Change, that human activity is unequivocally the cause of climate change. 97% of the world's climate scientists agree with that statement. There will always, of course, be a small number who disagree, but nonetheless, the vast majority feel that that is absolutely the case. And now we'll run through the slides to give you a little bit more detail. So this shows carbon dioxide concentration in our atmosphere since 1960. And I hope you can see that the chart is very simply going up. And I'm afraid it continues to rise. We have not peaked at carbon dioxide concentration and emissions going into our atmosphere. We have not managed to stop that rise as yet. What that means is that the global temperature is going up as well. So the different colors of different metrics, different measures, I hope you can see that they match quite exactly. And since 1850, you can see the 1.1 degree that has risen since that time. And this steady sense as well of rise over time. There'll always be peaks and troughs, but I hope you can see that even with the peaks and troughs, it is still going up significantly. Now, climate change and temperatures around the world, it's a very complex system, but we mustn't hide within that complexity to say that it's not real. And this slide really tries to do that. So there is one small patch of Antarctica, which is the area that's in blue, that was actually cooling until 2016. But I hope that you can see the majority of the rest of the world are the yellows, the oranges, and the reds. And what gets really frightening about this is when you look at the red up the top of the planet around the Arctic, and you can see that those areas are experiencing above 2 degrees centigrade temperature rise. What that means is that we had areas of the Arctic that were burning this year, and we're also seeing permafrost melting at speed. Permafrost locks in a whole load of carbon gases. When that changes, when it melts, we start to see positive feedback loops, which means that the climate can change even more rapidly. So overall, the world is getting warmer, but there are specific areas that are getting hotter even quicker. And actually, even that area around Antarctica is now beginning to change as well quite rapidly. And this slide, I hope, is particularly useful. It tries to make it very simple, that in the blues, you have the coolest years, and in the reds, you have the hottest years. And I hope that you can see that from 1884 to 2020, you have more reds on the right-hand side of the picture and more blues on the left. And I hope that you can also see that the 5 warmest years on record have really all been relatively recently as well. Forgive me if there's occasional background noise. I have a dog who is around my feet who is being particularly needy this evening, so forgive me. What all of those temperature rises mean is that the Arctic sea ice is changing and changing rapidly. So the Arctic is losing its ice very quickly indeed. New shipping channels are opening up. It could be argued that that is a good thing, but nonetheless, it's impacting on species habitats very quickly indeed. So this is the overall sea ice that's decreased. And you'll see as well that there was one area in Antarctica up until 2016 where sea ice was actually increasing in that blue area. That has now changed, and even the Antarctic sea ice is now decreasing across the entire planet. So what does that mean in reality? What do all of those charts tell us? Well, on the left-hand slide of this picture, you have an image of a glacier, the Muir Glacier in Alaska in August 1941. And I hope you can see that the glacier is there. It exists. If you look at the picture on the right, it's from exactly the same point in August in 2004. And you can hopefully see the glacier in the background, that area of white up in the mountains. It's retreated that far, and that the fjord is almost completely lacking now in ice. That white mark on the hillside at the back, I don't know if you'll be able to see my cursor or not, that is where the glacier was up to in that area. So the ice has retreated massively, and that's what we're seeing. The last glaciers in Africa will disappear in the next 10 or 20 years. We're seeing the European glaciers retreat at enormous speed. And even in Greenland and other areas, glaciers are disappearing and disappearing quite quickly, which is terrifying. With all of that extra heat, a lot of it is locked up in the oceans. So 90% of the energy is trapped in oceans. And as we see more ice caps melt and indeed the ocean start to warm, it expands, and therefore we're seeing sea level rise. And the next slide shows that. So this is sea level going up. It doesn't sound like by very much 3 millimeters every year. But actually, when you think about that globally, that's an enormous amount of it rising around the planet. So we know that sea levels are going up as well. This has been measured for a long period of time. And these two pictures really try and drum that in, what that means if we don't spend any money on protecting our capital city against it. So this is a very famous picture for EastEnders, which will be on, presumably you guys don't watch it that much because you're here with me this evening. This is a picture of the Thames running through London. If we don't invest in the Thames flood barrier and improve it and spend billions of pounds on it, this is what was predicted at the end of Frozen Planet 2. That is our capital city inundated at its very central core by rising sea levels. Now, I do not doubt that we will not spend the money on the Thames flood barrier to try and protect the capital city against rising sea level. I do, however, doubt very significantly whether we will spend the same amount of money protecting areas of Pakistan, Bangladesh, and indeed other parts of the UK from similar sea level rises. We are going to see inundation of not just countryside and coastal areas, but also inland around tidal rivers too. This is going to be the case. And sea level rise is a reality that we are already experiencing. And many of you will have kept your eye on COP27 recently in Egypt, where there wasn't enormous progress on climate change, but there was some progress on setting up a budget to protect those areas that are most affected in the world, including island states, who simply have no recourse to protect themselves against this. So why does it matter? If climate change is real and it's happening, why does it matter? What does it mean for us locally right here? So in a high emission scenario, the UK will experience warmer and wetter winters. I know that sounds crazy when you think about it being -5 to -6 out this evening, but don't forget this is a blip in an incredibly warm year that we will have. We'll touch on that in just a moment. I hope that you remembered that just a couple of weeks ago, we were all gobsmacked when we were still getting up to 15, 16 degrees. Hotter and dry summers, I hope that you'll all remember what this year was like, and indeed more frequent and intense weather extremes. And in 50 years' time, it's predicted to be between 1 and 4.5 degrees warmer in the winter and 30% wetter. You think about the rain that we had last month, that's quite remarkable how wet it's going to be. And summers will be between 1 and 6 degrees warmer and 60% drier. Well, again, when you think about that, we were 40 degrees this summer. Imagine 46. And that is quite hard to get our heads around for the difference that it will have and the impact on our lives. And this is where we've been. It really tries to bring it down into one slide. So there we are existing on our planet. And of course, we've been watching COVID very carefully indeed. We stopped flying. We locked people up in their houses. We worried about it enormously. We did something instantaneously about COVID. We invented a vaccine, which has allowed just about everyone to get back out and enjoy their lives again, of course, depending on where you are in the world. And now behind that first tidal wave is the second, the recession and the cost of living crisis that so many people are deeply concerned about and are facing. That's harder. And of course, the government is struggling to manage that, as are governments around the world, but nonetheless, measures are being taken around that. Lurking behind it is climate change, which we so far have almost struggled to do anything about. We have made some progress, but we are still not tackling that enormous challenge. And behind all of that lurks the terrifying spectre of biodiversity collapse and the very systems that keep our lives of a high quality and cheap and occasionally free. The air that we breathe, the biodiversity we enjoy, the pollinators that come and fertilize our crops, pollinate our crops, all of those are at threat from biodiversity collapse. And we're very good at dealing with things that are immediate. We're far less good at dealing with things that are relatively slow in our lifetimes, but which are very big and very quick on a planetary scale. So this is our challenge. The cost on us as individuals is significant. You're already seeing food price rises due to a war between Ukraine and Russia. And indeed, there are other parts of the world that were already struggling before that. And as we see the global climate change and the ability to grow crops in different areas, we're going to see increased issues around conflict and food supply. And indeed, whereas we will probably be able to pay our way out of that, it will affect households across the UK and globally as we see our food prices rise. It's highly likely that insurance costs will go up as well. Many of you will have seen the fires that were in North London this year, which destroyed houses. And if we see increased flooding, and we'll come on to that in a moment, it will be the case that insurance in responding to those extreme events will go up. The good news is that all of the energy that you're having to pump into your houses at the moment is likely to decrease as we get warmer winters. But unfortunately, we're probably going to have to invest in air conditioning to keep our houses cooler during the summer. So unlikely that we're actually going to see a reduction in our energy bills, unfortunately. But of course, the real costs are going to be to our children and our grandchildren, which are predicted to be much higher than we're facing at this moment in time. This is something that is going to intersect with generations to come. And I promise that this slide is, I hope, one of my most negative, and we can start to build up a little bit hereafter. This is an American slide, which shows you within the central core, rising sea levels, increasing CO2, rising temperatures, more extreme weather, and then the impacts of those around air pollution, how diseases will move, increasing allergens, water and food supply, extreme heat, and then the impacts on human health. So you're going to see an increased level of cardiovascular disease and asthma. You're going to see malaria and dengue fever appearing in areas where they've not been for hundreds of years. You're going to see cholera spread, malnutrition, and unfortunately increased levels of forced migration, with some terrifying statistics at the high end for around 2.5 billion climate refugees by the end of this century, which is terrifying figures, with enormous levels of mental health impacts and other things that fit with that. And indeed, we saw another 2,500 deaths above the expected norm this summer from the heat levels that we had. So some quite terrifying impacts that are going to face us as a species in the next 50 to 100 years. So I hope that this is the real call to arms for why we need to make a difference and really do something about climate change. And on a local scale, we're going to see more of this. We're going to see communities hopefully working together to protect their homes, but this is going to be more regular for people having to use flood barriers and sandbags. We're going to see villages and communities cut off due to floods and all of those events that we've seen quite a lot of over the last decade. But to bring it even closer to today, this is a satellite picture of the UK taken this summer. And I hope you can see that our green and pleasant land, especially in the southeast and the Midlands, is very much an orange and brown land from one of the worst droughts that the country has ever experienced, particularly bad in the southeast and in East Anglia as well. And what that means, it means a range of things around water supply and everything else. But in terms of Ashdown Forest, we managed to dodge a bullet this year, because these pictures are not taken on Ashdown. These are large heathland sites in Surrey that burnt this year, and significant areas of them burnt. And we are very fortunate, and I'm very grateful to all of you for not barbecuing on the forest, for putting out cigarettes, for being very careful. We won't be able to continue dodging bullets. We're going to have to do enormous amounts of work to avoid these fates. But unfortunately, it is going to happen to us, and we need to make sure that we are doing everything we can to mitigate against this. But rising temperatures will cause more extreme events, such as heath fires on Ashdown Forest. And as I said, lurking behind all of this climate change sits biodiversity loss. So everything that is red in this picture is where high levels of biodiversity have been lost. And everywhere in blue is still where it's relatively intact. So you can see parts of Alaska, Canada, northern Siberia, where biodiversity is actually still relatively intact, above 97, 98%. Don't forget, this is number of species, this isn't biomass. We'll come on to that in just a moment. You can see substantial areas of the world have lost well over 40% of their biodiversity, which is frankly remarkable. And that's human pressure that we have introduced into these landscapes. And what that means in reality are fairly harrowing pictures like this. These are see polar bears, which are not out on the sea ice because the sea ice is not there. And so they have been forced to come into towns and cities, and they are here eating on a municipal dump because that's the only food that they can get, because they cannot hunt the seals, because they can't creep up on them in the sea ice. So they're having to change the way they live their lives. One of the world's biggest carnivores, I think it's the world's biggest land carnivore, is suffering a radical change to its lifestyle because of human pressure. And more locally, you have images like this. This is the marsh gentian, which the heath at Ashdown is incredibly famous for. We're one of the only sites in Sussex with marsh gentians, but we had our worst year on record this year because of the drought. Now, there are other factors behind that around grazing and the lack of grazing, so these flowers get swamped very quickly. But it is certainly the case that our bogs and our mire systems are drying out from drier conditions. And so rare and protected species like this start to struggle even more. So why does that matter? If Ashdown was to fundamentally burn, or if it was to change, why does it matter? Well, Ashdown is an incredibly important habitat. Everything in purple on this map is the only climatic area in the world where lowland heathland can exist. So up through the top of Spain and Portugal, northern France, all of Denmark, just around the tip of Scandinavia, and all of the UK has the right climate for lowland European heathland. So that's the only area in the world that it can exist. It's one of the world's rarest and most threatened habitats. And many of you will know Ashdown as absolutely beautiful in August as the whole site turns pink from the heather. And we get birds like this wheatear that fly all the way up from southern Africa to come and use the heaths and the insect glut that we get during the breeding season and the warm summers that we have. So many of you will know of heathland ash heather, but it's much more than that as well. We've got a range of really interesting species, and I particularly want to draw your attention to these three because they exist in the slightly wetter and damper areas of the site, which are some of the ones that are most threatened. So we've got cow wheat up in the top left-hand corner. That's a food plant for a whole range of rare butterflies. Bottom left, we've got sundew, which is one of Darwin's favourite plants, and he studied it on the forest. It's a small carnivorous plant, so it actually catches insects and digests them to supplement its diet. And then on the bottom right, we've got one of Sussex's only 2 colonies of marsh fern, an incredibly rare plant which exists in wet areas. And it's a huge colony that is on the forest. And again, it needs those really damp conditions. Ashdown is very famous for its dragonflies and damselflies. We have 26 species. This is one very much up close, a fantastic macro photograph. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is ponds and streams dry up through the summer. So the breeding success of these species is going to be compromised unless we can do something about this. So we're looking very carefully at how we manage the waterways on the forest. And indeed, we've got some incredibly rare bird life. So at the top right, you've got the redstart, which flies again from Africa to be with us every year. That's the male. He's very, very beautiful. On the bottom left, you've got the lesser spotted woodpecker, incredibly rare, really declining across the whole country. But Ashdown and the New Forest seem to be 2 particular hotspots for this species. And on the top left, you've got the nightjar, which flies all the way up from southern Africa. And it chirrs in the evenings and in the morning, sounds like a stick stuck in bicycle spokes. And on the bottom right, you've got the Dartford warbler. It's those 2 birds, the last ones, the nightjar and the Dartford warbler, that give the forest so many of its protections against development and keep the forest and the surrounding area safe. So that it remains the open green space that you know and experience. So some incredible species that exist on the forest and make it their home. So you would assume that with all of those protections that we'd have lots of heathland and it would exist across the country. Well, it is quite dispersed, but actually all of those little dots that are in purple, which is the lowland heathland in the country, they all fit on the Isle of Man, which is what the red arrow is pointing to. That's all of the heathland that we have in the UK. And we've lost between 75 and 90% of heathland, depending on different counties, since the Industrial Revolution. So cataclysmic rates of decline. And this slide just drums that in. This is the heathland area in 1800, and the big blob of purple right in the middle is Ashdown Forest with some surrounding other areas. We fast forward through to the 21st century. I hope that you can see how much we have lost. I'll just go back and then forward again. And you can see that the blob in the middle is Ashdown and what's left of the heath. And if we didn't have Ashdown, we really would have very, very little heathland left in Sussex. And it's enormously fragmented as well. And that's drummed in by this species, which is one of our iconic species on the heath. It's the silver-studded blue butterfly. It's absolutely beautiful. It's tiny. It's smaller than a postage stamp. It's got a symbiotic relationship with heath ants, so they benefit each other so they can both survive. But it doesn't fly very far. It won't move over big roads. It won't move over big plantations. It certainly won't move through housing estates. So the butterfly was all the way through the southeast of England before myxomatosis in the 1950s and 1960s, all the way up into Scotland. All of these dots represent 10-kilometre grid squares where the butterfly was found. But with climate change and with myxomatosis and a whole range of other management issues, we're seeing a huge species contraction. So it's now extinct in Scotland. It's missing through the Midlands. And with just a few colonies left in Sussex, mainly centred in East Sussex on Ashdown Forest. And even in the Thames Basin Heaths, which is one of its strongholds, it's decreasing, which is it's not good. And unfortunately, as the species gets fragmented, if it then has a heath fire on the area where it exists, it can't then recolonize. So that whole colony is lost and simply disappears from the area. So fragmentation linked to climate change and other human pressures, we're seeing a removal of species from our landscape that have been here for many thousands of years. And it's particularly worrying about what is happening to the insect population. So this slide needs just a little bit of interpretation. On your y-axis, so that's the one going up, you've got how much biomass is captured in a sweep of a sweep net. So this is a scientist going through and sweeping a net through vegetation and then weighing the amount of insect life that they have caught. And then along the x-axis, along the bottom, you've got from the 1970s up to 2013. And what I hope you can see is that there was around 90 milligrams for every 100 sweeps of that net back in the 1970s. Fast forward to today, and we've got about 10 or 15 milligrams. So a huge loss of biomass. So that's the number of species. That's the actual weight of insects that exists. And to sum that up, I found this graphic recently, which is a little bit dramatic, but nonetheless, I'm sure that many of you remember in the 1990s, your windscreens being covered by insects. I wonder how many of you had to clean your windscreen, perhaps from dust, but probably not from insects this summer. And this slide goes so far as to suggest that if we don't arrest that fall, we won't be around in 2050. Now, I think that's an exaggeration, but nonetheless, insects absolutely underpin our way of life in so many different ways. And this slide, which is now quite iconic, shows one of the biggest impacts. So this is a Chinese fruit farmer who is pollinating his fruit trees by hand because they have eradicated the bee colonies from the area. The area has been so heavily sprayed with chemicals, and indeed the impacts of climate change as well, that unfortunately the local population of insects has been so heavily destroyed that they can't now pollinate the crops that these farmers are growing. And we are seeing significant levels of biomass decrease in the UK as well. There was a study out just yesterday by Kent Wildlife Trust, which showed a 64%, I think, loss of biomass in the UK for insect populations, even in the last 10 to 20 years, which is quite terrifying. And again, back on the forest, just to drum in what it's going to mean for us. This is the view from just outside the forest centre near Wych Cross, looking out towards London. You've got the Exmoor ponies grazing in the middle. And then you've got all the lovely changing colours of the beech and oak trees in the background. And you'll all know that the forest is incredibly special for bluebells in the spring. Unfortunately, we don't know what's going to happen to our beech trees under climate change. There's a lot of discussion about what it could mean for them being able to survive and certainly being able to reproduce. And bluebells need really quite damp conditions underneath those woodland areas. The UK holds 50% of the world population of bluebells, excuse me. And it's of deep concern that as the weather patterns change in this country, what will happen to the bluebell population. So even things that we take for granted in our landscape could well be affected by climate change. And I promise we're getting to the end of the pictures of showing all of the things that can go wrong. But I did want to finish just with this one. Many of you will think that's a little brown job of a bird catching a maybug, and indeed it is. Actually, it's not a maybug, it's a different type of beetle, but it's a meadow pipit, and they're the ones that you will see all over the heath, even at this time of year, and they fly up. And you'll think about, why does that matter if they're disappearing? Well, many of you will enjoy being out on the forest and have probably experienced hearing cuckoo out there as well. Well, the south of England has lost 70% of its cuckoo in the last 40 or 50 years. They're going up by about 30% in Scotland. So it's not an overall increase, but they are moving where they are in the country. And the reason I put this slide up is that is a young cuckoo that has parasitized a meadow pipit nest, and it's being fed after it's kicked all of the other chicks out of the nest. And the meadow pipit now believes that the cuckoo is just a very large young meadow pipit. So if meadow pipits decline, cuckoos decline. So a bird that is iconic for spring, which is written about both in Winnie the Pooh, but also in Shakespeare and so many of the other historical writings, is simply beginning to vanish from our landscape. It's going the way of the nightingale, which so few of us will now hear, and indeed the turtle dove as well. So there is some good news in all of this, is that we will see some of our species change. So this is a willow emerald damselfly. This was not in the UK until 2009, when it arrived in East Anglia. And due to the temperatures, it's now made a rapid expansion. It's now all the way up into Yorkshire, and it's all the way across to Gloucestershire. And this is a very common species, and it will continue to thrive and expand. And what we'll see is a lot of our rare and more interesting species disappear, and a lot of our common species do better. So what it really means is that the world will be a little bit more boring, because we're going to lose some of those rare and interesting species that accompany us on this planet. So what can we do? So many of you will be aware that we are trying to limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. That is looking particularly challenging. In the worst case scenario, we're predicting a 4-degree increase above historical norms, which is enormous and associated with some very, very serious problems indeed at the high end of all of the scales. The answer will be somewhere between those two temperature ranges. 4 degrees is if we make no attempt to cut our emissions, and there are some attempts now being made globally to cut emissions, and the UK proclaims itself to be a leader in this effort. So there is a lot that is being thought about. What can we do on Ashdown? So there are a range of things that we can do, there are a range of things that we are doing, and there are things that we need to work towards. So we presently heat the Ashdown Forest Centre with the device that is on the top left-hand corner, and that is a biomass boiler. So we cut wood off the forest and we burn that in the boiler to heat the centre. It's not particularly brilliant, but nonetheless it does have quite a low carbon impact from using the materials that we can harvest off the forest itself. So that's good, but it probably needs to be a bit more efficient, and it certainly needs to be improved in the heat that it kicks out. Top right, you've got a very impressive tractor shed, which has a huge amount of solar panels on the roof. I wish that was ours, it's not. We do have some solar panels on our roof, but not nearly as many, and they're now quite old. So we need to increase that and look what other renewables we can bring in. And our vehicles that we use to operate on the forest, both our tractors, but also our 4x4s, are all diesel powered. And we need to think carefully about what we can do about that. And indeed, we can manage our woodland better to lock up more carbon. We are at the moment in the process of looking at the carbon that the habitats can lock up. So we're doing a carbon audit. So we've mapped the whole forest. We're using government figures to see how much carbon we can lock up. And we're going to then improve those habitats, I hope. And I'll speak about that just a little bit in a moment. We're also looking at a fire plan so that we can protect properties on the forest from fire. And we're doing that in association with East Sussex Fire and Rescue. And we're speaking to Wilton District Council about putting in electric charging points and seeing what we can do. So there's a whole range of work that we are starting. We can do more on other areas of the forest. So everything that's in purple on this map is what is wet heathland. And that's where we have a real advantage, a real opportunity to lock up carbon in peat. And this picture shows some of the wet areas of the forest. It's the damp areas which are really some of the most biodiverse, and they have this ability to lock up carbon as well. We've been extracting that as a species for thousands of years. This isn't on Ashdown, but it is elsewhere where peat cutting is indeed still going ahead. And that's just simply throwing carbon straight out again as the myland area dries out, but also to then burn that. This is Ashdown Forest back at the beginning of the 20th century, and those are stacks of peat being cut by local families and used for fuel in their houses. Actually a very, very toxic fuel and not good for you at all to burn in your house, but for those who were economically challenged, nonetheless, it was incredibly important. And a lot of damage was done to the bogs on Ashdown Forest through this. It's not enough just to leave the bogs alone, you need to manage them. And this slide shows people walking through a bog that doesn't have grazing on it. And what you're seeing is those grasses come up above people's waists, that starts to smother the mosses that form the peat, and it means the peat starts to break down. So it's not enough just to leave them alone. You have to graze them and manage them and look after them as well. And some of them are so badly damaged by having peat cut out of them and drainage lines put into them that we're now putting dams across them as well. This is a group of volunteers this summer who are installing what we call a very glamorous leaky dam. It allows some water through and holds other bits up. So it's just re-wetting the area, which holds up more carbon. There are, of course, other ways to do that. You can create that using a fence and introducing some native animals to the area. Many of you will have already guessed that is this, which is the beaver. And there's a lot of discussion going on around the country about beaver releases. They're now back in the wild in Scotland. They're now back in the wild on One River over in Devon as well. And they're reappearing throughout Europe. They do all of this work at very low cost. They are an ecosystem engineer. And as much as we're not planning to introduce them onto Ashdown immediately, there are people nearby who are giving it quite serious thought. They were hunted to extinction on the forest several hundred years ago. They are a remarkable species for helping with local climate change and indeed flood alleviation. So we are aiming to be a carbon negative business. So Ashdown is hoping to lock up more carbon that it produces by 2027. I hope we are already there, but I can't prove it yet. And that's why we're doing the audit work and really trying to find out how much we're producing and how much the forest is locking up. We've got a lot of work to do in that area. Now, I'm just going to take a little aside about why planting trees is not necessarily going to save us from climate change. Many of you will have heard that planting trees is critically important, and indeed the right tree in the right place is vital. But those of you who've been kind enough to ring me up and offer to pay to plant trees on the forest, I'm just going to explain a little bit about why that is not a good thing to do on one of the rarest habitats in the world. So we know that the Earth's forests and oceans do absorb a huge amount of carbon dioxide. In fact, if they were pristine, they'd be locking up 1/3 to half of all global emissions. So they're incredibly important. And virgin rainforest, which is at the top of this picture, and pristine oceans down the bottom, is wonderful. The trouble is, we don't have those anymore. We have been damaging these habitats for a very long period of time. And we're particularly worried, even with the change of government that's happened recently in Brazil, that the Amazon rainforests are likely to flip from locking up carbon to actually emitting it by 2050, in the next 30 years. So that's frankly gobsmacking that the lungs of the world are being so heavily impacted. They're actually now going to start producing more carbon than oxygen. And when we look at this slide, which I hope you'll be able to see a bit better than at some of the other presentations, because you're a little bit closer to it, everything in purple in that map is actually areas of mainly tropical rainforests now that are emitting carbon rather than locking it up. So you can see that purple ring all the way round the Amazon, and indeed in large parts of Asia as well. And even in the Congo Basin, where some of the least disturbed rainforest in the world exists, we're now seeing large areas of carbon being emitted back out. So now only 1/5 of the CO2 emitted by humans is actually being locked up by our forests. So if I leave you with one message tonight, it is as simple as this. We have to stop tropical deforestation now. And environmentalists have been saying this for many years, since at least the 1960s, but this has to stop. We have to stop degrading and destroying the world's forests, especially in the tropics. It's where they have the greatest ability to lock up carbon. We must stop this. But nonetheless, it is important to think about trees elsewhere in the world. It's not just the tropics, and we need to think about what that means. And DEFRA in their 25-year environment plan have an ambition to plant 11 million trees by 2042. They are really important, and trees have these wonderful impacts. They do all sorts of brilliant things, from absorbing carbon to providing shade, improving water quality, producing food, making us feel better, and of course, providing sustainable timber. So there's remarkable things that trees do for us. And it brings communities together. Here is an American community who are planting some trees on some grassland. It's wonderful. They seem to have planted about 4 trees in this area. You can see behind them that we've got a tractor. Don't think it's electric. We've got some very large 4x4s, but nonetheless, these are some trees going into the landscape. And we've got school children coming together all over the world, and on their t-shirts, it says 11 million trees. So fantastic. This whole area is being planted up. Wonderful. I won't be cynical and ask how much carbon is produced by the t-shirts and the hats. It's far too late in the evening to be cynical. And of course, here he is again. It's something that absolutely everyone can get behind. And you can have a gold-plated spade and you can plant a tree. You can do it outside the White House. And planting a tree feels like making a real difference to climate change. And if you do that, you can offset your flying, you can live your life as you like. I wish it was that simple, but nonetheless, it is great that it is something that everyone can get behind. And there are some remarkable records around the world for people who have gone to extremes in planting trees. Now, when we do this live, I ask people what they think the Guinness World Record for the number of trees planted in 24 hours is, because Antoine Moses up the top, who's a Canadian tree planter, has that world record. And the guesses have ranged from a few hundred up to a couple of thousand. The actual answer is for how many trees he planted in a 24-hour period was 23,060. That's how many he put in, going through the night, supported by a team bringing him more trees as they came through. Now, he is a commercial tree planter, and it's a remarkable record, but it's interesting the way he was actually planting them. If you look, he is surrounded by cut down tree stumps. So this is quite a commercial setting that he's putting them back up in that area. Down in the bottom picture, you've got a district of India. It's an enormous district. And again, I asked people how many trees they thought could go in there. And the answer there is frankly gobsmacking. They planted 49.3 million saplings in one day. Now, we won't talk about the fact that that field looks like it has been used for crops and other things relatively recently. But nonetheless, it's fantastic that they were doing this and making a real effort. Planting trees can make a difference. And indeed here, this is an example of where trees have been planted in a really good way. So this is on the edge of the Gobi Desert, and you can see that grasses, local cut grasses have been laid down around the area. Local families, local people are involved in caring for those trees and looking after them. But the Gobi Desert is expanding, and what the Chinese have tried to do is increase the woodland cover with the Great Green Wall around that area. So they planted 4,500 kilometers by hand and by plane. Unfortunately, the mortality rate of those trees, especially where they're not looked after as they are in this picture, is really quite extreme. And some estimates go up to around 85% mortality rate of the trees in this landscape. So they're all planted, but nonetheless, unfortunately, many of them are dying. And Turkey had a National Forestation Day in 2019. They planted 11 million trees across 2,000 sites. Now, there's some debate within Turkey on the exact mortality rate, but nonetheless, one of the agencies involved has determined that over 90% of those trees then died, unfortunately, due to a lack of aftercare and other reasons as well. So it's one thing to put a tree in the ground, it's quite another to keep it alive long term. And unfortunately, this is absolutely the case in the UK as well. Many of you will be aware of the challenges around HS2. And a couple of years ago, they put in 350,000 saplings, all protected by these tree guards, but 80% of them died. And the statement from HS2 was that replacing the dead trees was more cost effective than watering them. And of course, that's the case because moving water around is extremely expensive. So doing this by hand and then caring for them produces a huge amount of emissions and a load of challenges that come with it. And of course, here in Sussex, we've got an enormous problem with fallow deer. They simply destroy a lot of our woodland areas and they destroy a lot of the tree planting, even with tree guards. They're a huge number of deer that now roam the area around the forest and the surrounding farmland, impacting on woodland and scrub regeneration. And this is one of the areas of our woodland where we've actually fenced off a small area, and you can hopefully see that really the only area that anything's growing is within that small fencing, where we've got some bramble and some honeysuckle coming back, but the deer are damaging so much around it. So if we are going to put trees in, we have to do it very carefully and we have to look after them long term. It's as simple as that. And I want to show you a slide of another way to do this. So many of you will have heard of the Nep estate. These are their arable fields before they stopped farming. Now they haven't planted any trees in this picture. This has all happened naturally. So all of the trees that you see there are planted naturally, either being by blown out from the extended hedgerows or from the woodland, or being planted by species like jays, who can plant up to 16,000 acorns each year and only recover a certain number for their own food requirements. And then those acorns get away and start producing young oak trees. So you can see whole landscapes can be changed at very, very low cost by using natural processes. And this is something that we need to think very, very carefully about natural regeneration. Those trees tend to do better, they need no aftercare, and they're planted in the natural environment by natural vectors. So there's a real another way to do it. And indeed, where are we planting these trees? When you offset and when you think about where you give your donation to, a lot of global charities are putting trees in some quite interesting places. So This is one of the charities who are planting trees in Brazil. And what you're looking at is a wetland system. We've already discussed about how some of these areas are not appropriate for tree planting. So we need to think very, very carefully about where we put these. There's a lot of discussion about what trees we should be planting in the Arctic areas and what we do more damage than we're trying to do good. And when we've looked at where we might put the trees back in the landscape, the IUCN produced this map. And the areas in dark green and indeed in light green is where they were identified for tree planting, which is very interesting when you cross-compare to the savanna and grassland distribution map, which of course is an incredibly important habitat for a whole range of species. And the suggestion was we should be planting some quite significant areas of those. The challenge is that those habitats are home to some of the most famous species in the world, from African elephant, meerkat, cheetah, and some bird species like lilac-breasted roller. These are incredibly important species that live in open landscapes. So it's not about just creating treed landscapes across the world. It's one of the reasons that Ashdown needs to remain open. Many of our species need that open habitat, not heavy woodland cover. So where we plant trees in the wrong place, at best, they will fail. At worst, we could threaten the existence of countless species and ecosystems. And this is the real challenge that we need to think about. It has to be the right tree in the right place. And it is the case that we have simply no idea how many trees are planted a year globally, or indeed how many survive, which is quite remarkable when you think about the amount of money that's going into tree planting schemes around the world. There is an opportunity locally around Ashdown to make some huge differences, though. So you have Ashdown Forest up in the top right-hand corner, that green mass with the hole in the middle. And then you've got Knepp, which is the rewilded estate over towards Horsham. And then you've got down in the bottom left, you've got Climping, and that area in blue in the sea is the kelp forest that's being restored by a whole range of fishermen and inshore fisheries and local supporters. And the area in yellow is the idea of a wheel-to-waves, a connectivity landscape of over 50 miles to allow species to move in response to climate change. It's trying to break down some of that fragmentation in the landscape. And there's some really exciting people beginning to become involved in that conversation around Wakehurst and other areas like that, about how we might try and join that up in a voluntary fashion with a whole range of local farmers. And this very much follows some principles called the Lawton Principles, which are very simply about making a nature reserve bigger, better, and more joined up. We know our existing nature reserves are simply not good or big enough to stop the biodiversity loss that we are experiencing. This is exactly what we're trying to do around Ashdown. We're trying to bring back some of the species that we've lost, like the beautiful sheepspit and the bog orchid, which has vanished from most of the UK. We've lost the grayling in the 1960s. It vanished, which is a shame. It's a beautiful big butterfly and it's disappeared from Ashdown. We've lost the water vole. Could we bring that back? We're giving some slightly crazy thoughts to about whether we could consider bringing back black grouse onto the forest. The last one was shot in the 1930s, just outside the forest centre. There's only about 5,500 birds left in the UK. They're likely to go extinct in my lifetime. Wouldn't it be wonderful to see that bird recovering again? They're dying out in Scotland for many reasons, but some of them are around climate change and wet springs, which are washing the chicks out of the nest. And then there's another discussion going on at the moment about the potential to maybe reintroduce pine marten back onto Ashdown Forest, which is being led by the Wildlife Trust as well. So there's a huge opportunity to restore some of the biodiversity that we've lost out of our local landscape over the last couple of 100 years. And we have a wide range of local farmers who are coming together and landowners to really think about how we might do that together, which is incredibly exciting, about how we can work together to improve the habitat quality around Ashdown Forest. Now, when we sat down with that group, the first species that they came up with remarkably was bison. We are not planning to reintroduce bison to the forest anytime soon. We do need to think very carefully about grazing more of the forest, but it's not involving bison. Although this is the first bison that's been born in the UK for many hundreds, if not thousands of years, over at the Wilder Bleam Project, which is part of Kent Wildlife Trust. And it's a beautiful young animal. So with all of that thought through, what can you do? What are the lifestyle choices that you can make to have a bigger impact around carbon? So everyone can help. It's as simple as that. Absolutely everyone can. You can save energy. There's a whole range of ways of doing that. I know it's incredibly cold, and I'm not suggesting you do this evening, but it goes 13 degrees again on Sunday and Monday. Can you turn down your thermostat by even a degree? Can you think about, if you're lucky enough to have some spare money, can you insulate more of your house? Are there opportunities around that to save energy? It makes an enormous difference. Can you consider your transport options? Many of us, especially in rural areas, do need cars. Public transport is difficult, But how many times a year do we need to fly? And quite terrifyingly, the recommended amount, if you can, is to fly once every 3 years, certainly not several times a year. So considering your transport options, if at all possible, can you do a meeting like this electronically rather than do it in person? Needs some thought. There's a whole debate around shifting diets. Of course there is. Now, what I'm not suggesting for a moment is that you all become vegan overnight. What I am, however, suggesting is that you don't think about eating meat 3 times a day, 7 days a week. There are other opportunities to think about how you can shift your diets, and there's some wonderful information and books out there for you on that. And really planning your food. This is going to save you an enormous amount of money at home anyway, because you're not wasting it, but it's also going to make a huge difference to the climate too. We waste about 40% of the food we produce in this country. It's absolutely gobsmacking, 40%, yet we talk about a food crisis. And of course, we can repair and recycle and reduce as well. We all know that. We know that we don't need the latest thing. How do we make sure that we therefore reduce our expenditure, reduce our output? And of course, this is critically important. There are some people who choose to go up gantries on the M25. That's entirely their decision. What you can do safely from home is lobby your decision makers. Don't think for one moment it doesn't make a difference. It does. When they receive a message, it means that it moves up their agenda. If you send an email a day, think how much you are achieving. It really does make a difference, and it doesn't cost much to tell people how much you care. And there are many environmental organizations who can help you with messaging, or of course come up with your own. This investing responsibly makes a huge difference. Think about where you bank, think about where your pension might be, all those different elements. Think about what the company is who's holding your money, how they're spending it. Are they funding fossil fuels, or are they actually thinking about some of the other opportunities long term? And there are increasing numbers of investors and banks who are being very open and transparent in how they're investing your money. Do think carefully about that. Of course, I'm going to tell you to respect and restore green spaces. That's critically important. And I'd love to see you up at the Ashdown Forest Centre, or indeed out on the forest itself, volunteering, helping with the shop, the visitor centre, helping us run events. Would be absolutely fantastic. But fundamentally, don't give up. Do not give up hope. We can make a difference. All of those things will need at some stage supplementing with increased technology as well. And this is top right, one of Bill Gates' projects at the moment that he's sponsoring, which is carbon capture. So pulling carbon dioxide out of the air and other climate gases, trying to then convert them and lock them up underneath the ground or underneath the ocean to sequester them away and make them disappear. Now, the technology is not good enough at this moment in time to make a fundamental difference, and it's not going to be enough to save us. We've got to do this alongside everything else we've already spoken about in this presentation. Because if not, this is the landscape that we may well see on Ashdown Forest in the future. This is in northern Spain. This is heathland burning. I do not want to see this across Ashdown Forest. It is terrifying. So we've got an enormous amount of work to do. What I do want to see is UK habitats that look more and more like this. This is a river in Poland, which has not been straightened. It's naturally moving across its floodplain. It's holding water back. It's got huge amounts of wild animals moving through it, and it's got native and natural forests, which are locking up carbon. And again, in the wetland areas around that river, those carbon sequestration is happening. It's locking up carbon into that landscape. How can we restore more of the UK to be a naturally functioning system is the challenge for all of us. So there really is hope. Don't feel you've got to read this, but I don't think this is complete greenwashing. This is a statement from National Grid, which would not simply have happened when I was younger. They are saying that they have the technology to achieve net zero by 2050, and they're absolutely committed to leading that transition. Now, that is absolutely remarkable for a company of that size to be setting out that ambition. We need to make sure that we hold them and policymakers to account to make sure we deliver that. And I will read this out because I think this is very powerful, that individually we can each make greener daily decisions and take actions that collectively will affect the planet for good, from the way we travel to what we buy and eat. Because the more action we all take, the less our climate will change, and the more livable the world will be for ourselves, our progeny, and all the rest of the magnificent abundance that is life on Earth. Now, come on, that's worth making a few lifestyle changes for, isn't it? And that's a BBC correspondent who accompanied Greta Thunberg on her journey over to one of the climate conferences in America on a sailboat. So that is absolutely the case. Do not give up hope. We can make a difference if we work collaboratively, because we owe it these communities and young people around the world to make a difference. It is our planet, but it is certainly theirs, and it's going to be theirs for longer than ours. So we owe it to them to make a difference today. I'm aware that I'm getting close to time, so I'm going to just race through the attack on nature because much of this has changed as well. So under the Liz Truss government, there was a lot of discussion about pulling back some of the nature laws, and even senior Tories, as in William Hague, felt that this was very much a mistake. So this covered 4 areas: investment zones, fracking, the retained EU law bill, and the environmental land management payments, which is how the environment and agriculture are paid for in this country. Will be. I'm going to particularly talk about the retained EU law bill. So I'm not going to talk about investment zones, except to point out outside those investment zones. But nonetheless, these were areas where planning law would be reduced in certain areas to allow development to happen. And that was very divisive, and indeed much of that has now been reduced in scope already. Fracking was, the moratorium was being threatened. That's now back in place. So again, I won't discuss it particularly. There wasn't a suggestion there'd be rigs on top of the forest, but there was a suggestion that the pipes would come underneath the forest and extract gases from under there, which could have impacts on water quality. And the reason we were so particularly concerned is that when you look down south of London, you can see that the Weald was particularly identified for holding on to shale gas. And this area in the middle, which of course includes Ashdown Forest, is where the shale oil was particularly considered to be rich. The retained EU law bill is where we're particularly concerned. So again, don't feel you've got to read all of this, but in a nutshell, all of the law that we have set over the last 40 or 50 years from Europe has a sunset clause put on it. So if it is not reviewed by the end of next year, it simply disappears off the statute books. Now that might not sound like a bad thing, but what that means is that there are 550 bits of environmental legislation that DEFRA is responsible for, which it needs to review by the end of next year. It's failed its own targets to set new targets under its own Environment Act. So I'm afraid I do not have faith at this moment in time that DEFRA has the resources or ability to review that law. And what that means is that the very protections that keep the forest safe from development are under threat today. So this is of particular concern, and if any of you would like to speak to me further about the retained EU law bill, or indeed speak to any of the wildlife organisations, there is a lot of information out there about this. This bill is passing through government at the moment and needs a lot of thought, because these development areas would be at serious risk if the retained EU law bill was to pass as it presently stands. And I won't talk too much about environmental land management, except to say that the forest receives a very significant funding from countryside stewardship, which can only be spent on the biodiversity on the site. And we are concerned that that funding needs to continue. And therefore we want to see the replacement, which is environmental land management, have similar, if not enhanced levels of funding to look after biodiversity. Because the worst case scenario that we were looking at during the last Prime Minister's, during her time in office, we were looking at potentially fracking underneath the forest, the loss of the international environmental protections, and countryside stewardship not being replaced. So some quite terrifying elements. And just to finish off, I'm going to speak very briefly about Ashdown Forest's future. We produced a vision for the forest last year, which is where the carbon negative business came from, and where a whole range of other things were identified as well about how we're going to take the forest forward. And many of you will have been aware that on the 21st of November, we made a decision to introduce car park payments onto 45 of the forest car parks. This was not something that was done lightly, and there was not a single champagne cork popping on the 21st of November. This is unfortunately the case that we do not receive a penny from central government to look after the visitor access onto the forest. So the 1.5 million visits that we get a year, we receive no funding for them. And especially during COVID, our car parks and our tracks took an enormous beating. And with climate change now impacting with heavier rainfall, droughts, and indeed increased snowfall from time to time as well, it means our washout events are significant. So we simply don't have the resources to keep the forest safe and accessible. So this is something that we didn't want to do, but we felt that we had to do. And again, I'll happily take any questions at the end, or indeed if anyone wants to come and see me separately to talk through that element. But it is now fully in place and operational across the forest. It's not a question of car park payments or fundraising, it's car park payments and fundraising. And we've very recently produced this book, which is an absolutely beautiful set of pictures from Ashdown Forest through the seasons, produced by a local photographer, Craig Payne. They're absolutely spectacular, and all of the good pictures in this presentation are Craig's, He's a remarkable landscape photographer who's taken the most beautiful images. And we did a big launch event for this a few weeks ago now at the Ashdown Park Hotel. So the Ashdown Forest Foundation, a couple of whose members are on the call this evening, ran this event, set it all up, and it made a fantastic amount of money for the forest. It was hosted by Katie Derham, and it was playing the Four Seasons, Vivaldi's music, with a string group who were accompanying it. And it was an absolutely lovely event. And we're hoping to obviously do lots more fundraising events to support the forest in the future as well. And just to finish off, this is something that the forest has never done much about. So many of you will be aware that A.A. Milne wrote and E.H. Shepard illustrated Winnie the Pooh on Ashdown Forest in the 1920s. So it's his 100th birthday coming up between 2024 and 2028. We've got a real opportunity to do something about this. So the toys themselves are in America, they're in the New York Public Library, but the home of Winnie the Pooh exists, but it's struggling for all of the reasons that we've spoken about today. How can we use that message to go out and help people understand the needs of the natural world and what a difference it makes to them and their families as well? So there's a huge amount of work we can do around the bear, because this picture shows how he was an instantaneous celebration, how incredible it was when he first came out. So at the top right, you've got a picture of Milne holding Winnie the Pooh on his lap. You actually got Christopher Robin up there as well with his nanny and Eeyore in front of them. And this is a group of local children who have dressed up as the characters. So you've got Christopher Robin, you've got Roo, you've got Tigger, you've got Eeyore, you've got Owl and some of the rabbits, you've got Piglet, the world's most terrifying version of Piglet that I've ever seen, and Winnie the Pooh there in the centre as well. So it was an instantaneous global celebration in the 1920s. It's going to be a celebration in 2026. How are we going to make the very most of all of that to really bring in the funding that the forest so desperately needs and communicate the natural world to a new generation of people? I'm going to end there. Thank you so much for staying with me through what is actually quite a challenging presentation. There's a lot to take in, and I'm very aware of that. It's a very big subject which impacts every single human and every animal on this planet. So if you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to pop them into the chat box, and I will try and answer them. But thank you so much for listening. I've put the email address of the organisation down the bottom. If you don't want to ask a question now, if you want to ask it via email, you're very welcome to. But thank you for staying with me through this hour. If you'd like to ask any questions, please do so. Thank you. And I will wait for a moment to see if any questions pop up. If not, and you're heading off, thank you very much for coming. And I hope you stay warm this evening and look forward to some slightly warmer weather over the weekend. And have a very happy Christmas and New Year if you're not going to ask any questions now. Okay. Brilliant. Thank you, everyone. That's incredibly kind. Thank you so much for coming. Good night. Speak to you soon. Bye.